Hello, and welcome to SoE TV, that's School of Education Television. I'm Dawn Crim, your host, the Associate Dean for External Relations here in the School of Education. Today, I am joined by Dean and Dr. Kenneth Teitelbaum. Ken is our School of Ed Alumni Award winner for this year. Thank you for joining us, Ken.
Thanks very much, Dawn. It is an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, Ken got his Ph.D. in 1985 from the School of Education, the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. And since 2001, according to the U.S. News World Report, that department has been the #1 graduate curriculum and instruction department. How does that make you feel as an alum knowing that?
Well, it's obviously a fabulous achievement. I'm not sure how much I would rely on U.S. News and World Report for some of these rankings.
Understandable.
But when you get the ranking, certainly it means something, and you want to, certainly let people know about it. And I think it's wonderful to be one of the top programs in the country, whether it's #1, which is amazing for 15 straight years, or just to be known as a top program. It's wonderful to be a graduate of a department that is that visible nationally. And it's in some ways not completely surprising. I mean, I've had experience at other institutions, and there is not a department quite like what is at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, in large part because of the faculty that are here, but also because of the students who are attracted to come here, the graduate students and the undergraduate students. It's just a wonderful place, and being #1 for that long a time is a pretty amazing accomplishment. And again, it makes all the alums, I'm sure, very proud to be graduates of the department.
Wow, we'll see. And as a proud alum, you have gone on to be a faculty member across a number of institutions. But more recently, you served as the Dean of the School of Education and I think Human Development at Southern Illinois University. And currently, you're the Dean of Education at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. What would you say as you think about your career and now having 2 deanships of School of Educations? What kind of preparation did you have in getting your Ph.D. here that prepared you for those 2 deanships?
The one at Southern Illinois, I should just say, was the College of Education and Human Services.
Thank you.
And the one I have now at University of North Carolina, Wilmington, is the Watson College of Education. The Carbondale one was interesting because it was a very large college. It wasn't just education. It was also social work, rehabilitation, counseling, kinesiology, and things like that. So it really was a kind of a broad number of programs besides education. At the UNC Wilmington, it is a little bit more narrowly education, although we do have programs in instructional technology, mostly teacher ed, but also higher education, ed admin, and things like that. My experience at UW, and specifically the Department of Curriculum Instruction, and I should say I actually started in the Department of Educational Policy Studies, and I minored in Ed Policy Studies, so I want to give a shout out to Ed Policy Studies as well as Curriculum Instruction, because there were people in that department that were also wonderful to work with, as well as Curriculum Instruction. I think the main thing really that I got from working at UW was, there were a couple things, but I would say in particular was a really substantive, critical questioning of things. And I wouldn't say, I never had a plan or a trajectory to be a dean.
Okay.
That's kind of the furthest thing on my mind, I think, when I was starting. I often found myself in leadership roles, and so I guess in a way it kind of makes a certain sense, being a program coordinator, and then being a department chair, and then being a dean. But when I was at Wisconsin as a doctoral student, certainly I wasn't thinking in those terms at all, so I wasn't preparing to be an administrator.
Okay.
But I did get so well prepared in terms of the knowledge base that I had about K-12, pre-K-12 to education, in terms of the kind of robust inquiry that the faculty members certainly exemplified in all of our courses, the kind of students that I worked with as colleagues and the faculty, and how supportive and nurturing everybody was. And so I think as an administrator, I think the connection in particular is to approach my work in the same kind of way, to be supportive to the people I work with, to ask questions, to make things problematic when necessary, not just to accept the kind of assumed wisdoms that are put forth. Of course, sometimes that could also cause me some trouble, but by and large, I think it's been a very fulfilling career, and I actually have loved being a dean during these 8 years. I mean, obviously a lot of frustrations. Higher ed has changed a lot, which has made it more difficult, but I like being in the position of trying to help people, faculty, staff, and students. I like trying to create programs, helping people to create programs, and all that kind of work was part of the base almost of being a student at in CNI here. It was part of that intellectual vibrancy of being here. It was such a wonderful, vibrant experience for me that it really stimulated me to think about a lot of issues and to think about how I could help to make educational settings more nurturing, more supportive, more evidence-based, more in terms of commitments to issues of social justice, democracy, the kind of things that I learned a lot and talked about a lot when I was a doctoral student here.
Okay. Well, let's stay with that. Thinking about issues and how education has changed and social justice and democracy, how is that different now in the higher ed setting over your 8 years when you think about the social justice issues around education? As a dean and as you work with your faculty to prepare the next group of students that are going to be in our schools, how does social justice play a role?
Well, I mean, for me, schooling is very much connected to issues of social context. The kind of society that we have, the kind of world that we create, the kind of experiences that we provide to students. And it doesn't seem to me to be a very radical kind of perspective to say that in a democratic society that we would want to have social and cultural relations that in fact are based on equitable practices. And that if we're a democratic society, we should try to provide for a robust, strong form of democracy where people feel not just that their voice counts, but that they want to be actively engaged in civic life. And so that's the part that, for me, connects social justice to what we do in schools and in colleges of education, because we are part of the larger world and we're, in essence, creating the world in the work that we do. The difficulties in the last 8 years, and I'm a little wary of trying to present this as some kind of dichotomy. It's not either or. It's not like there was a golden age at some point and now we're in dystopia. And everything is so horrible. There always are spaces to do good work. But I would say those spaces, and this is a very disappointing thing to say, I think those spaces have eroded somewhat. I think there is, and there's always been issues. Again, I don't want to present this as if there was some romantic age that we've now left, but there always were frustrations for deans, there always were difficulties for faculty, but I think there were more spaces to do good critical work. I think there was more opportunities to talk about social justice issues, to talk about multicultural issues, to talk about democracy and things like that. Because of the intense auditing culture that we're in now, because of all the accountability measures, because of all the reporting that we have to do, because of the increased calls for kind of standardized knowledge, standardized testing, high-stakes testing, et cetera, I fear that the opportunities for people in their classes with their students to talk about these larger social justice issues in some ways has decreased somewhat. That people are so concerned with meeting certain expectations that they don't have as much kind of flexibility, as much autonomy to do that kind of work.
So when I think about the students that are attending your college, our college, those students that are excited about teaching but are concerned about the accountability measures, and they really want to just make a connection with students and help people get to the next level, but they're feeling discouraged. What are some of the things we can say to those students to encourage them and to say, you know, teaching is the noble profession and there are rewards that are not just based on compensation or things. There's the intrinsic rewards. How do we continue to bolster and support and celebrate that for our students?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I think it's a fundamental question for anybody working with teachers, teacher education, as a dean or whatever. The rewards of teaching are still there.
Okay.
I mean, you are able to watch and help young people grow. You're able to see the light goes off. You're able to help them to imagine new possibilities for themselves. You're able to teach them the kind of content that will help them to negotiate the world that they're going to live in. Those things are still there, and we have to be sure that current and prospective teachers still understand that those basic rewards of teaching are still there that make it such a fulfilling profession to be a part of.
Well said. Well said.
It's a passion, you know.
And it comes out, and that's what's important. I mean, when I think about, you know, the opportunity for you to be here with us over these next few days to celebrate your Distinguished Alumni Award honor, that passion and the focus and the lifelong work of teaching comes out. So I'm pleased to see that and hear that.
Well, thanks. And I'll just say something in all honesty, really, because you hear so many naysayers, and I could identify them, but I won't
need to.
Right, since people will be watching this. There are people who are naysayers out there about teacher educators and about university professors. And I mean, I haven't done a big study of it or anything like that, but I've been at a half a dozen or so universities and colleges of education, including the current one, University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And from my observation, from my experience, especially as a dean and as a department chair, where I do get to see a lot of my colleagues in terms of the work, I am in awe of the level of work that they do. I am in awe of the efforts that they make for their students out in the schools, in their research, to try to improve education and to try to explain things as clearly as possible to the people that they work with, both in and out of the classroom. I mean, some of the people talk negatively about education colleges. I just don't see it. I see people working. I mean, I'm not going to say it's 100%.
Right.
I mean, it's not nirvana, you know. But people work awfully hard to try to do good work, to create the kind of teaching profession that we're looking for. And it's very frustrating when you see, when you hear claims made with really very little evidence, and you see kind of caricatures of teacher educators in specific and university professors in general, because I think most of them work awfully hard and do really great work for our students.
Well said. When I think about some of your scholarship over the years, a lot of times people think about professors writing books, doing researching, but sometimes they don't realize that deans are also practicing their scholarship. So I understand that you recently had a book published. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about your book?
Yeah, it's hard as a dean to continue a research agenda, but I have been able to. I've written some chapters, some articles in the last half dozen years that have been published. The book is actually a co-edited book.
Okay.
It's co-edited with Joseph DeVitis,
okay.
and it's called School Reform Critics, The Struggle for Democratic Schooling. I almost slipped up. I wasn't sure if I even remembered the title, but I do remember it. School Reform Critics, The Struggle for Democratic Schooling.
Okay.
And it's 15 chapters, and you might be interested to know that 5 of the chapters, including mine, obviously, I wrote a chapter for it as well, which I can talk about, are written by UW graduates.
Ah.
You know, and not because they're UW graduates, because of the great work that they do.
Okay.
And the title is, we wondered about the title because it could be taken really in a couple different ways. But for us, school reform critics are the people who are not the so-called school reformers. We are school reformers of a different sort, and we're critics of the current school reform movement, because we don't feel that the current school reform movement is really preparing for the 21st century in the way, for schools in the way that we think ought to be done.
Okay.
And so we have 15 chapters, and what we very specifically tried to do is to write not just to scholars, but to practitioners as well.
Great.
And so we actually have a superintendent of schools who has written a chapter, and we have a couple of people who have written chapters really by working with students in schools, and in some ways expressing what some of the elementary and secondary school students are talking about with
Okay.
regard to some of the school reform issues that are taking place. My chapter is called, if I can remember it, Teacher Education in Volatile Times,
Okay.
Forward to the Basics. And what I do is I look at the teacher education reform movement, and one of the points I make is that in a way teachers, and more recently teacher education, has been under attack for as much as 100 years. This is a long-standing problem in terms of the teaching profession. Like I said, what's a little bit new is the extent to which teacher education is now being attacked by critics as for the failures of public education. And there certainly have been some problems in public education without a doubt that need to be improved. And so part of it is talking about the whole teacher education reform movement. But then what I do is I talk about what I consider to be some fundamental understandings about teaching and teacher education that are getting lost, that are not really being talked about as much with all the people who are coming out with these, what I would say are corporate school reform measures.
Okay.
And they're very basic things. For example, that teaching is a lifelong activity. And you hear people say, we need to have teachers come out right away and be outstanding teachers. I never expect that from a teacher education program.
I mean, it's an unrealistic expectation to think someone entering the profession will already be a master in the profession.
Exactly. Exactly. And I mean, what we can do is prepare them for the baptism under fire in the best way possible. The kind of questions they need to ask, the kind of areas where they can, improve and things like that. So things like teaching is lifelong activity, the importance of context in terms of where people teach with regard to the kind of reforms that are needed. It's not the same in every place. The fact that, really teacher education is very limited in terms of how much time we really spend with students, how much we can actually go. So it's always, these are connected understandings. And I just fear that some of the school reforms that are out there that are being talked about, really, a lot of the people don't really, I hate to say it, but they don't really understand teaching or teacher education. This is not to say that we should not be open to suggestions and not be open to improvements. Absolutely. But some of the measures that are being talked about, I don't think will help our schools, and I don't think they'll help our colleges of teacher education at all.
So I'm going to ask you one last question.
Okay.
Just in all that you've shared about your book and your time as a dean and the undergirding that you received as you thought about your career in education, what advice would you have for students that are currently thinking about going into graduate level work around teaching? So not your teacher for the classroom, but the Ph.D. students, the master's level students that are thinking teaching or practicum. What advice would you have for them?
Well, I come from it probably from somewhat of an odd perspective in a way, because I always found the graduate level work that I did, I mean, this is like old-fashioned, very intellectually stimulating.
Okay.
I mean, I found I was a history major and a sociology minor as an undergraduate, and I was actually going to go into doctoral programs in history, and I was accepted in some programs. That's where I was going to go, and then I won't go into it, but I ended up changing and going into education. I find the whole field of education and what goes on in schools of tremendous intellectual interest, but I also think it's of interest in terms of if anybody's interested in trying to play a role, no matter how small, in trying to create a more decent society, in trying to create a world that we all can be more proud in some ways to live in, and in fact that has a brighter future for all of us. So I think the idea of doing graduate work in education is partly because I think it's a real interesting field to learn more about, and I think in the practical sense you can always learn more things, even if it doesn't seem direct, more skills, more knowledge, whatever it is that can actually help you in educational settings. It may not seem direct right away. I think Dewey talked a little bit about, John Dewey, about like a reflective arc. And then sometimes you learn something, it doesn't necessarily have direct relation. It kind of goes through an arc and you come to understand things better, and then you come to understand how the practice is related to the theory that you read about or the research or whatever. And I think it all can be beneficial. And if you go into it with that idea, you go into it to learn, to be a learner, a lifelong learner. I think all graduate education can be helpful. And for those people who are going into university life and thinking about being professors, with all the things that have occurred that maybe have not been very positive over the last few years, it's still a pretty good gig to be a faculty member. Spoken as a dean.
All right, you heard it here.
I think it's a great life.
Talking about the great life in education and higher ed. Well, Ken, that's all the time we have today. I really appreciate you coming and spending some time with us. And again, congratulations to you on your Distinguished Alumni Award.
Thank you very much. It's a really wonderful honor to be here.
And thank you, the viewers, for spending time with us on this episode of SoE TV. Take care.